Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Razan Pereira. North Korean leader Kim Jong Un boarded his private train on Friday and headed back to Pyongyang after directing some harsh criticism at Washington during his first summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying the US negotiated in bad faith when he met with President Donald Trump in Hanoi 2 months ago. Putin has said Kim needs international security guarantees if he is to end his nuclear program. Such guarantees would need to be offered within a multinational framework, he added, following talks near Vladivostok in Russia's far east. Kim praised the summit as a very meaningful one-on-one exchange. Putin said North Korea's leader was fairly open and had talked freely on all issues that were on the agenda. The meeting followed the breakdown of talks between the US and North Korea in February when Kim met Trump in the Vietnamese capital, Hanoi. Those talks reportedly stalled over North Korea's demand for full economic sanctions relief in return for some denuclearization commitments, a deal the US was not willing to make. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Putin-Kim summit. Joining me on the program today are S.R. Tayal, former ambassador, Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, JNU, and K.V. Prasad, Senior Associate Editor of The Tribune. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. Your thoughts on the Putin-Kim summit?
I think the agenda was, of course, the developments in the Korean Peninsula. And after the Hanoi summit between President Trump and Kim Jong Un of 27-28 February, it has been a bit of a stagnation. And Kim Jong Un is saying, North Korea is saying that there was some bad faith because there was a lot of preparation before the Hanoi summit, which did not happen before the before the Singapore summit of 2018. And if you look at the international press, South Korean press, there was some kind of expectation of a small deal, that there will be some kind of, not total denuclearization of North Korea, but they will blow up the nuclear reactor and say N1 testing facility for the ICBMs, and substantially some sanctions would be lifted. And in fact, in Hanoi at one point it was that some tables had also been laid out that some agreement will be signed, and then suddenly it all changed and nothing, and Trump walked out. And North Korea has been blaming Pompeo. Now they have blamed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Now in all this scenario, Russia is trying to deal itself into the game. We must remember, and Russia's official position is that six-party talks should be revived. And that, of course, we don't want Korean Peninsula, and their first priority is that Korean Peninsula should be quiet, should be peaceful, and denuclearization really is their second priority. But they want to be in this whole picture where they were totally marginalized, because China has been in the picture, because Kim Jong Un has been going to China and briefing President Xi Jinping at least 4 times he had visited last year. So this is, so two things I think the two countries have achieved. Kim Jong Un, that he is not isolated, he has the support of Russia, and so diplomatically it shows more self-confidence. And President Putin had invited him several times, then only he has gone. So again and again very open invitations had come from Russia, and so it is like strengthening his hand while dealing with the United States. And for Russia, where they are facing a little bit of isolation here and there, they are coming back into the international scenario, international game of different powers, whether it is Syria, whether it is Iran, whether it is Korean Peninsula.
Absolutely. K.V. Prasad, as a journalist, how would you look at this meeting? What were the takeaways for you on expected lines, do you think?
Well, I don't think there was any takeaway per se, because if you look at the end of the day, if Kim Jong Un was expecting some kind of a relief in terms of the international sanctions or some kind of a sideway, I think that thing didn't. There was nothing on the table. Quite possibly because Russia officially does go with the sanctions and also wants denuclearization as a goal. It have a different thing. So I think here it was also said and reported in some of the sections of press that he was looking for a large workforce from North Korea which works in Russia, almost some 10,000 to 30,000, the figures could be varying. Those people will have to be sent back by end of the December because the sanctions kick in and they have to go back. So it's an issue for the country, because if 30,000 people or 10,000 people, whatever the numbers. So I think he was also looking, and apart from what Ambassador Tahil did mention, the Russians want to come back. To add to what he said, Iran, it's also Afghanistan. You know, they're expanding their international area, and I think they want to be seen in different sections where hotspots of the world and play a leadership role. So it went both ways.
Right. You know, Professor, how would you look back at the Hanoi summit in February and now this one?
I think it's very interesting you asked me how to look at Hanoi summit and connect it from there. To me, it is a continuation of Hanoi summit, which, as Ambassador Tahil said, had abruptly come to an end. We were expecting some kind of a joint communique being issued, but it wasn't, and it kind of stopped halfway. And if you notice that in this case, first Fiona Hill, the advisor to President Trump, followed by Stephen Biegun visiting Moscow. Stephen Biegun is special envoy for North Korea for denuclearization talks. So to me, this is in continuation with Hanoi talks. And that is why if you see at end of that long 5-hour meeting of two leaders, President Putin said that, I am supposed to carry the message from here to American administration. So it, to me, shows that United States is working in tandem with this summit meeting. Why would Putin accept such a role, kind of an intermediator? Because if you remember, of all the leaders that we are talking of, Kim Jong Un, the 34-year-old leader, this was his 11th summit meeting. He's already held 4 summit meetings with President Xi Jinping, 3 summit meetings with Moon Jae-in, South Korean president, 2 meetings with American president. It's unusual that American president, United States has no diplomatic relations with North Korea. And if you remember 2017, the kind of saber rattling that was happening, unusual that American president decides all the way to come to Asia and have 2 summit meetings. And of course, when he was in Hanoi, he had a summit meeting with the Vietnam president also. So in that sense, he's obtained an enormous diplomatic traction and space for himself. And that was why Putin, as Ambassador said, was inviting Kim for a long time. And now when it worked out, Putin is clearly seen now as a player in the game. In fact, he has clearly mentioned that Kim basically needs 2 things. One, security guarantees for the regime, in this case the family, and of course also guarantee of territorial sovereignty of, there's no forced merger to happen. And in this case, Russia can clearly extend security guarantees, and that projection of Russia as at least nuclear superpower was advantage of Putin now being part of the negotiations of resolving North Korean kind of brinkmanship, and it had kind of become a brinkmanship. So I think you saw clearly an advantage point for President Putin, especially because in this case, Kim never went to ask Xi Jinping as to how to conduct himself with Putin. And the body language, I mean, one can go on talking, the body language was very different. And I think in that sense, this was an unusual kind of a former allies and close friends reviving that, relationship which had enormous warmth in all 3 generations of North Korean leaders. So outcome here, I think, is not to be expected even. It's an intermediate effort to break ice so that some kind of negotiations can continue, and I think we will see that happening again with President Trump again.
Right, all right. So that having been said, Ambassador, the professor believes and thinks that it's a continuation, really, the Vladivostok summit of the Hanoi summit. I want to go back to a time earlier, before that. A lot was made of the Singapore summit. Both sides, North Korea and the United States, claimed victory. They said, it's going in the right direction. But then we saw it followed up by Hanoi. So how would you look back at the first summit and then the 2 summits that followed?
I would say the first summit, the Singapore summit, was truly historic because it broke the ice between the 2 countries. They are still sort of enemies because it is the armistice of 1953. They don't have a peace treaty. And the President of United States just meeting the leader of Kim Jong Un in itself was unprecedented, and it gave some kind of an equality to North Korea and some kind of international status. And also it at least identified the objectives, the goals, the targets, where they want to reach. How they will reach, of course, there was no flash in that, and that's where we are. But that there should be denuclearization, there will be economic progress of North Korea, and there will be some kind of a peace treaty between the. So those three objectives remain. How to reach there? I think what Professor Swaran Singh said, and in that security guarantees when President Putin is talking about, ultimately if there is an agreement between United States and North Korea, some kind of international guarantees perhaps would be required. First of all, who will inspect? IAEA will have to come in. You know, there has been a model where the Iranian fuel has been sent to Russia. If suppose tomorrow, after America backtracked from the agreement with Iran, suppose they do not adhere to whatever their commitments are, then what happens? So Russia, China, maybe India also could play some kind of a role in these international security guarantees, or if some say fuel is to be shifted, or uranium, enriched uranium is to be shifted, that it will be in some kind of a moratorium, and when everybody adheres fully to their part of the bargain and agreement, only then it will be disturbed. In all that kind of a scenario, Russia could play a very important role, and I think security guarantees is a very telling sentence which President Putin mentioned in his brief.
Right. So, K.V. Prasad, so after looking at all these summits, 11 like the professor listed out as far as Kim Jong Un is concerned, has his stature grown in the world?
I mean, you're talking of the Korean,
so
North Korean.
Yes.
The question is, he has found acceptability, that the fact that world leaders are talking to him. At one point of time, it was said only China was the official communicator to, and it was China which held the leverage with North Korea. That has, and as Professor Swaran Singh also mentioned, just before the Singapore meet, there were very sharp exchange of words. There was a Twitter war between the American president and the kind of things that were there. So after that position, you move on to have a summit meeting, because again, it is said President Trump does this things totally, which is out. It's not the traditional way he handles the American president. He's handled it differently. So I think all that adds up, and of course, for all the sanctions, that I think the Kim's biggest move would be trying to see ease of sanctions. That is what they were trying at Hanoi too, which didn't happen, because the Americans had a rigid position, the position they wanted to get going on certain factors. So which led to, in fact, I think if the reports were right, after the Americans blamed the Koreans side for the North Korean side for the failure, there was a midnight press conference with North Koreans denying everything else. So I mean, there could be any other thing, but certainly for the Junior Kim, remember 2002, his father also traveled to Russia to meet President Putin. So it was something. I mean, again, that was a different era and different time. But now I think certainly, I think the world leaders also know they have to carry it forward. I mean, just threat alone is not the thing. You need to. How do you take it forward?
Maybe 2019 could be the year really, as far as some of these problems are concerned. Maybe we'll get some kind of a solution in Central Asia as well. But Professor, what is it that North Korea and Russia wanted to achieve out of this summit, and what do they want going forward?
I think it's first of all showcasing that they could potentially revive that old warmth that existed. If you remember, his grandfather was almost stage managed by the Soviets as a leader in North Korea. In mid 1950s, there was enormous opposition. Again, Soviets came in and influenced the decision making. So the first leader, the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Il-sung, had a long inning and entirely to the support of Soviets. And then, of course, Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, also had a fairly close relations compared to the first leader who visited 13 times Moscow, of which 4 times were undeclared unofficial. The second leader went there about 4 times. 3 times actually, once President Putin actually in 2000 had come into North Korea. to now, that effort to showcase that potentially warmth could come back in the relationship, and that is clearly seen as good for both sides. President Putin is looking for a greater space, a greater footprint in Asia Pacific, and this is a burning problem in Asia. And if Putin thinks he can contribute to the outcome here, that will raise the stature of President Putin himself. And as we've been discussing how Kim has also become increasingly acceptable to both sides. So the fundamental point here of the meeting was to showcase that there is a potential spark here. But for the immediate, Kim had gone there basically to explore brass tacks. What can he get in terms of, so Russian and North Korean trade, for example, has shrunk less than half, from about $78 billion in 2017 to just $34 billion last year. 30,000 Koreans used to work in Russia, are now only 10,000, and there are questions because of sanctions that they may not be allowed to continue after their current visas expire. And they are the main source of employment and foreign exchange for North Korea. So brass tacks as to how President Putin can somehow allow them to overcome, deal, skirt directly, indirectly with sanctions. I think that must have been the real brass tacks conversation on the ground. If you remember, not only United States, UN Commission, which is overseeing implementation of these sanctions, had accused both Russia and China in supporting Kim in skirting around sanctions. So there is certain amount of truth in the fact that Kim has survived. Not only he is assertive, is pushing a certain kind of brinkmanship vis-a-vis President Trump. These are the two important allies. But so far it was appearing like China was the mentor. And in that sense, I think Putin saw a certain space for himself. So obviously both sides had both long-term and short-term, gains to set up that meeting. And it worked logistically also fantastic because Kim travels through his train. Vladivostok is about 80 kilometers from the border of North Korea. And President Putin was in any case traveling to Beijing. So it's a stopover in between for him. So logistically also it worked finally that they could meet there. And I think interesting body language and the long 5 hours discussion, Kim staying 3 days there, is, I think, a great projection of warmth being a potential possibility in the relationship.
Right. So, taking the discussion forward now, Ambassador, what about North Korea's missile and nuclear program? That is the biggest worry really as far as the world is concerned. Are we going to expect, or do we expect any forward movement on that front?
North Korea did test this small tactical missile, but just I think to warn America and all that things can go back where they were in 2017. Now, in one of the statements, Chairman Kim Jong Un said that America must come up with some kind of an acceptable proposal by the end of this year. That is important because after that, President Trump will get into the election mode, and it will become very difficult for him to come to some kind of an agreement. And the threat is always there that Chairman Kim said that things can go back to where they were in case there is no movement. So he is trying to pressurize America and their negotiators. And of course, the policy is to shoot the messenger that President Trump, I believe you, I trust you, you are fine, but your Secretary of State is the mischievous person. In my own view, perhaps the National Security Advisor John Bolton is perhaps the more rabid anti more hardliner in the American establishment. But it is interesting that there has not been any attack by President Trump on Chairman Kim Jong Un, when all the language of President Trump is very intemperate towards any world leader. And similarly, the South Korean press, KCNA, as well as Chairman Kim Jong Un, any statement, they have just not criticized President Trump. So they still hope for some kind of an agreement, and perhaps they feel that they can work on President Trump's ego and try to get some kind of a deal where it's a small deal, where the sanctions are eased, but they do not commit or start on full denuclearization. So it is a negotiating stance, and one world can expect some kind of a testing so that the Americans get pressurized to not, because the status quo doesn't hurt America, United States. The status quo really means that there are no further tests, whether nuclear or ICBMs, which is fine for the United States. But it also means the sanctions will continue, which hurts North Korea. So status quo doesn't suit North Korea, and they will try to make sure that somehow sanctions are eased, and they will make some kind of moves so that America feels pressurized by some testing or by some other means.
Right. So, since we are here, since we are talking about Trump and the Trump administration, KV Prasad, where does the summit leave the United States and, more importantly, the Trump administration?
Well, two things, as Ambassador Tal rightly put out. America is heading for election year. So everything starts boiling to national domestic politics, and already it's quite a crowded field on the Democratic side. So the Republicans obviously have to work for that. Now, whether it works as a policy matter, I think nobody expected Trump to come out with a deal. For a person who pulled out of the Iran agreed deal, so how do you take it forward from there? I mean, if there is anything on the table, we haven't read or heard about it. If there was any talk post-Singapore, Hanoi, of course, was a total, it went the other way. So the issue is, how are you going to deal with the issue? For, as Ambassador Al said, the Koreans have a bigger stake, the Americans have a lesser stake in this thing. But America needs, also under Trump, America has withdrawn from its leadership of the world, that thing that it has always built upon. So it has left many of the problems to be dealt with by the regional or the local areas. I mean, they haven't really involved. In this case, after, as I said, they pulled out from the Iran thing, and it's a decade since the six-party talks fell through. So you need to have a new idea on the table. That, of course, we haven't really heard from the people who are involved. And is Putin exploring that? We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Professor, so is this going to be yet another red carpet event and, everyone forgets about it? Or are we going to see something concrete come out of this summit?
I think it's not an event that will be forgotten, because Russia is an important new player now in the game. And since you mentioned what it means for President Trump, he has clearly ceded a certain amount of space for President Putin to step in and play a certain amount of influential role in this case. What is important to also underline is that North Korea's weapons are clearly understood to be aimed for whom? It's obviously not aimed at anybody else other than the United States and its allies, of course. So that fear will continue to persist, that if we have not resolved this issue, then United States will have to at least stay awake, stay alert, to what can happen. And the fact that Kim Jong Un recently did conduct another test of a tactical nuclear weapon with a powerful warhead, as he said, clearly means that he's not stopping. He's in fact challenging the American administration, that he is pursuing his program forward. And I think the confusion here is that Americans wanted him to showcase far more demonstration of dismantling of certain, I think including Yongbyon nuclear facility, before they even consider sanctions being lifted. Whereas Putin has always had a very different idea on this, going to the extent that not only dialogue should continue, not only sanctions should not be constantly being sort of increased. He made a very important point right from the beginning, saying that once Kim Jong Un has opened up for dialogue, that gesture itself should lead to relief in sanctions,
right,
which has not happened. So I think now that view will get greater traction in negotiations as to should that be considered, that because Kim Jong Un is willing to talk, and his father had said the same thing to Medvedev in 2011, that we are willing to consider denuclearizing.
Right.
Though in reality that's not going to be easy. Assuming that even theoretically someday they have declared they have denuclearized, will you trust them that they cannot bring it back? So it's not an easy thing to really conclude and sort of find a closure to this. But targets are clearly Americans, and they cannot really skirt away, even when they are isolating themselves, going away from global leadership. This is not an issue they can kind of close their eyes on. Whether they work through Xi Jinping, they work through Putin, they will have to constantly keep their finger on the pie here.
Okay, quick closing comment from you, Ambassador, talking about Xi Jinping. Where does China fit into the scheme of things? What's China's game plan really going forward?
China is very critical. China would like to keep its leverage on the Korean Peninsula, and one view was that they will also try to use their influence on North Korea to get a better deal on trade with Trump. But I think it seems that America has been able to isolate the trade discussions from the Korean Peninsula issues, which in itself is a big plus for, I would say, for President Trump. But at the peninsula, my own view is that there is trust between North Korea and South Korea, so things will keep on going in the right direction between the two Koreas. But there is still lack of trust between the Korean establishment, North Korean establishment, and American establishment. There may be some kind of understanding and confidence between President Trump and Kim Jong Un, but Kim Jong Un doesn't trust the American establishment, and unless that trust is there, it will be very difficult to have a permanent settlement of the issues which we all know about.
All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.